Welcome. You have found Why We Are Christians. I'm Katrina Pierce, and in the first of two programs, I'm going to interview Alex Bischoff and find out how he became a Christian. Welcome, Alex.
It's good to be here.
Thanks for being here. I would love to start the story with hearing a little bit about where you grew up and how the first part of your life was.
So I was born in Pretoria, but I moved to Johannesburg when I was 2. That would be in South Africa.
That's quite a ways away from here.
A little bit.
Culture must have been very different there.
It was very different. My father was a very English person, very proud of his education. So he sent me to a private church school, which I went to for 11 years. And I'm sad to say I didn't hear anything that the preachers were saying. And I was just saying, when I left school, I counted the number of times I'd been to church and said, that's it, I'm good for the rest of my life.
Oh, so that wasn't an inspiration, that wasn't a walk of life for you necessarily. That was something that you were put into, maybe.
I didn't like it. I was a boarder for the second half of my time there. We had to come back to school on a Sunday evening. I wanted to play golf.
Yeah.
So instead I had to be playing, sit in the church, and we came up with all sorts of antics as to what we could do to pass the time, but it had nothing to do with hearing the gospel.
Right. Well, at a young age, it is difficult sometimes to focus on anything that isn't play. So that was more work at that time, I guess.
It was, and after school, I went straight into military. This was compulsory military service, and I was drafted to become an officer.
Was that your choice to go into military?
You had to serve 1 or 2 years. I was just 17, so I decided to serve 2 years and complete my national service commitment, and that drafted me onto the officers' training.
Ah, okay, so you had no choice.
No choice, and what happened is towards the end of the first year, Russia invaded Angola using Cuba as its proxy. And very late in the game, the CIA realized that they had not paid sufficient attention to what was happening. And so they secretly called on South Africa to intervene. South Africa was having sanctions at the time.
Wow.
And so one minute I was doing training, and some 6 days later, I was standing on a runway on the very northern Southwest African border, hearing an officer saying, will you volunteer to be a mercenary? If you are caught, we will ignore you, you will be shot. If you don't want to come, don't. Well, everybody volunteered.
Right, what are you supposed to do at that point?
And the next thing we did, we stripped off. We stripped down to no clothing on and got reissued with underwear and dog tags with no South African markings. We trained for about 10 days, and then we were airlifted by C-130 1,000 miles north. I was part of an armored squadron, armored cars.
How many in your squadron?
There were 20 armored cars, so it would have been 60 men.
That's
plus,
not a lot.
Plus support groups, way north in Angola. And our mission was to secure the road to an airport called Luso, which was on the Zaire border. And for the next 3 weeks, we fought down that road, killing everybody and everything.
Oh my God, how old were you at that time? That was
I just turned 18. I used to joke that I had killed more people than I had kissed, and that was literally true. And the sad part was the atrocities, the killing of women, children, civilians, animals. And that had a pretty devastating effect on my life.
I can imagine. That's going to change your view on life completely, to be exposed and deal with something like that, especially so young.
I don't think the human's equipped to it. I have post-traumatic stress disorder as it's diagnosed today. And what happened was, when I came out of the military service in January the next year, I was drafted back to the leadership unit, because I was one of the few officers who had combat experience. So I spent the next year as a senior instructor trainer. And tragically what happened was I'd met a person in the local city, Bloemfontein. I played squash with him. I was fairly good squash player, played for the South African team. And his son was one of my troops. And I remember him saying to me, please look after my son. And tragically, we were coming back from a field operation. I wanted to get back to the base. By then I was drinking quite heavily. It was the end of the week. I was in a hurry. We drove too fast. The vehicles turned up dust. The driver of his armored car leaned forwards, opened the hatch. He lost control. The armored car rolled and killed the young boy.
Oh my God. I can't imagine how that must
It was devastating to me.
affected you.
And the thing that really hurt was the military closed ranks around me. They didn't want to be found culpable for the accident. So they didn't tell me to lie, but they just said, you weren't going too fast, were you?
Right.
And so at the preliminary investigation to court-martial, I said I was doing nothing unusual. They found the young man responsible for his own death. And I can still see the father's eyes at the military funeral with the last salute. And he mouthed to me what happened, because he knew something had happened.
Right.
And unfortunately, I took on the guilt of the accident. It was actually just a tragic accident of many combined factors. But
knowing it and not being able to express it,
it was terrible. And of course, I was also sworn to 30 years of secrecy about the operation. So I came back into civilian life, having just turned 19 in end of 1976.
And the world is a different place. Yeah, you've been to a whole nother world.
As a complete mess.
Yeah.
And became a functioning alcoholic for the next 25 years.
What did you do when you came back? You came to the United States.
No, first in South Africa. Dad wanted me to go into the accounting profession. He was very involved in the computer industry. I'd learned to program when I was about 12. So I did my first year as an article clerk and learned accounting. Then I got seduced away by Burroughs to become a salesperson. And I quickly began to earn quite a lot of money selling computers in South Africa. And soon after that, I was at a nightclub. I was a gold card member, and I was allowed in early. That was the deal. So I looked to the far end of the room, and there was a group of ladies laughing and joking. And I'm a fairly big guy. I walked over to them and said, I'm a policeman. What are you up to? And one of them, who was quite cute, turned to me, and she soon after became my wife.
Oh,
she was.
We're missing the whole middle of that.
She was English. She was out on a nursing contract from England. We fell in love. We got married, and a year later we went back to England, where we.
So you moved with her there.
Got married. No, we went back to South Africa.
Oh.
And the problem was.
You got married in New England, and then you moved back.
Got married in London, moved back to South Africa, moved down to Durban, and the trouble was I was drinking heavily. And so it wasn't long before I was staying out late at night and under the influence of alcohol started behaving badly.
But you were when you met her.
I was then, and
But
I often spoke to her afterwards of why didn't she recognize that I was drinking too much, and she never saw it that way.
Right.
But I was. And at about the 7th year of our marriage, we were in real trouble. And so we decided to go back to England to make a new start. So we upped sticks, moved to England, and we actually moved into her parents' house. I went off to London to get a job. I got hired on the first day because of my computer skills and fairly good selling skills.
So you went thinking that you were going to stop drinking, or just...
I didn't think I had a problem. And so what happened was I would get on the train from Coventry, which is where the family was, which is about an hour's train ride to London, and I had a dual life. On the weekends, I was living with my wife, and by now we had 2 children, Stephanie and Victoria. They'd both been born in South Africa, but they'd gone across with us. And then I was living this other life in London, where I was carousing. By now I was sleeping with people who were not my wife, which was very sad. She suspected, but never confronted me. And one day, my daughters were 5 and 2, I announced that I was going to be leaving the marriage, and I left the marriage.
Oh, wow. You moved out?
Yes, it was very sad. The truth was I'd contracted an STD, and my wife couldn't know about it, and I was too ashamed to tell her what had happened. And so my solution was to leave the marriage. And so that's what I did, and a year later we were divorced.
Did you ever have, I mean, was God ever present in any of this to you, or was that just a faded memory so far
I
back
was
that...
by then a committed and convicted atheist.
Yeah.
I didn't see anything wrong with the way I was living. I was making a lot of money selling computers in the high-flying days of the personal computer
Right, and
uprising.
There was nothing that reminded you of that, though. There was nothing that came, not at that time.
Nothing at all, and I started a software company called Insight, and a couple of years later it was approached by an American public company called Verity. They wanted a relationship that I'd built up with Microsoft, and they bought us. And I remember going to my wife and my daughters and saying, I've got an opportunity to go to America. It will give us, as a family, all the money you need to have the girls go through school. And my wife said, yeah, that would be a good idea. Why don't you go? I thought I was going for them. In fact, I was just going for myself. It's one of the great sadnesses in my life, is to know that I went for myself. But the next thing, I was living in Silicon Valley, a multimillionaire,
Much different.
kids going to private school back in London. And unfortunately, I was still drinking just as heavily. So it wasn't long before the drinking caused problems.
That's not good for your, eventually your body's going to catch up to you.
I would sneak out the office at lunchtime. We'd go to a little girly bar at the far end of the road. And my friend Adam Meyer, who tragically died from alcoholism just a few years ago, and I would drink, and then we'd return to the office, and then we'd argue with the management. This wasn't a particularly good idea. And it all came to a bit of a shattering stop when I got stopped for a DUI one night. I'd gone into San Francisco to a singles evening, which was a little interesting because I was engaged to somebody else at that point. So I'm not quite sure why you'd be doing that. It was the Blue Angels were flying, and it turned out that three of us had our birthday on the same 18th of October, and we celebrated. I drove back. I got lost on the freeway. I got stopped, pulled over, and the next thing I was spending 8 hours at the compliments of San Mateo jail, which was not exactly how I thought my life should go. And that really began a process to getting sober.
Oh, really?
So that would have been October the 10th, 1998.
That gave you some downtime to stop. That probably forced you to stop, because you don't have access to any distractions in there.
I had to hire a driver, and I promised that I wouldn't drink. And what happened was I went through the Christmas, and then I enrolled for my community services. We had to do 5 days of community service. And on the Saturday, which was the last day of the community service, I was the guest speaker, and I was part of an acquired company. I was an acquired executive, to go to Palm Springs to receive an award for the software that the company had purchased.
Neat.
But we finished the community service at lunchtime, and a couple of the guys said, why don't we go for a quick drink? And I thought, well, that'll pass the time between here and the airport. And I can remember driving to the airport knowing that I was over the legal limit in this pouring rain. And I got a real shock, because I'd said, I'll never drink again.
Had you
and
up
drive.
to that point?
No, I hadn't.
Oh,
And here suddenly I was driving in the pouring rain, and I flew to Palm Springs. I booked myself for a massage because I was stiff from the community service. And I remember lying on the massage couch, and the masseur saying, how did you get so stiff? And I said, well, I was doing community service. And he said, well, do you think you have a drinking problem? And I said, no, I'm perfectly fine. And he carried on, and we finished the massage. Well, that next night, I was the guest speaker. And once again, I binge drank.
Oh.
And at 9 o'clock in the evening, when they closed the bar, I put 6 glasses of wine on the table in front of everybody. And then when that was gone, I invited my co-worker to the bar, and we had 2 bottles of wine. Next thing, I was suggesting that we spent the night together. She said yes, but maybe her boyfriend wouldn't agree to it. I've spoken to the lady about it. We laugh about it now. And I found myself walking towards my room at 1 o'clock in the morning, blind drunk, but I wasn't able to get drunk, saying, how on earth did this happen? Well, I'd booked to go back to the Monsieur the next morning. And so I rolled into his couch, reeking of wine and alcohol. And he said to me, I put up with you yesterday. He said, I'm actually an alcohol recovery consultant who does massage on the spare time. He said, you're an alcoholic and you need to go to a meeting of Alcoholics Anonymous. And I said, well, I don't like them. And he said, have you ever been? And I said, no. He said, well, there's your problem. Contempt prior to investigation. Mm-hmm. And so he made me promise that I would go to one 12-step meeting before I had another drink. And that was the 15th of March, 1999, and that is my sobriety date.
Really?
I stayed in Palm Springs for 4 days, played some golf, didn't have a drink, and that weekend I downloaded the material from the internet, and I read some of it, and I can remember on the Sunday afternoon I was writing my revised drinking plan. And as I wrote, I can drink 4 drinks because I'm bigger. My eye caught some of the material I'd printed out, and it said, we will come up with all sorts of unbelievable ways of managing our drinking. And I couldn't deny that I'd written, I'm bigger, and there to my left was a description of the alcoholic. And so I went to my first meeting that night, and there were 2 attractive ladies who were the secretaries. It had nothing to do with staying sober that had me go back. I went to meetings for the next 3 weeks looking to see if I could meet these 3 ladies again.
Hey, whatever keeps you going back.
They say whatever keeps you going back. Well, the Monday I had to go and see the counselor for my drink driving classes, and I told him that I thought I was an alcoholic, and he burst into tears. He said, I know you're an alcoholic.
To hear you say that was just
always knew it was you. I was the one who said I could drive better with a few drinks. And so I kept going back, and that began my program of recovery. But it was tough because the 3rd step says that we'll turn our life and our will over to God. But I was an atheist. And so I didn't know how I was going to do that. And finally I met an Irishman, and he always spoke about God. He just loved talking about God. And so I thought, well, I'll ask this man because maybe he can help me.
You met him in the class? Or?
I'd met him in the various meetings and going to dinners. And wherever we went, he'd talk about God. And finally, he took me into the woods in Mill Valley, and he showed me a little stream flowing down, and he said, could you make this flow the other way? And I said, no. He said, so there we've got it. You accept you're not God and you can't control gravity, and that'll be enough for you now. Do what I tell you to do for the next 3 months. At the end of 3 months, you can have your life back if you want it, or you can carry on. And so I began to do these simple steps of changing your life. And that same day, he also said to me, what troubles you most? And I said, I'm haunted by the pictures of the women and children we killed. And he said, I've got an idea. Why don't you go online, find Children's International, and start sponsoring children? And so I did that very day. 2 children, $35 a month each, and I've been doing that ever since then. And it's been wonderful to put their photographs on the fridge and watch these young kids in South America growing into new life. And I started to get well, but slowly.
You can't take back what you did, but you can make a difference from here on forward. And
it was not how I thought it was going to go, though. The first year, I did a God upgrade. About halfway through the year, I decided the sun and moon and the stars were more attractive as a higher power. And then at the end of the 2nd year, I became a practicing Buddhist. And along the way, I went to a Buddhist singles evening. And the exercise was to look into the eyes of a lady for 3 minutes, and I did. And the lady and I fell hopelessly in love. We went to South Africa, we went to England, met my children. And then we got into trouble. I was trying desperately hard to be a good, faithful man. What I didn't know is she loved somebody else, and I was an in-betweener.
Oh.
And so coming towards the end of the year, the relationship broke down. And then we got back together again. I suggested we went to Kauai. I was going to propose to her. And at the airport, she called me to say she wasn't going to be coming. And so I arrived in Kauai in early October 2001 on my own. And all I knew was I didn't want to drink. And so on the Saturday night, I went and found a local meeting of Alcoholics Anonymous. And I got lost in the little town of Kaloa. And it's important because I walked up the road and I remember seeing this church. It's one of these traditional little picket fences, white steeple churches. And I went to my meeting, came back, and then on the Sunday afternoon I was standing in the shower. I was hurting so badly. And I called out, God, please help me. And I heard a voice, and I don't hear things. And it was, you calling to me for help, but you won't come to my house. And I saw a picture of that little church. I knew exactly where it was. So I put my clothes on, jumped in the car. I was pretty scared, drove straight there, parked outside, and the pastor's son was in the garden. I called out to him and said, what do you do to come to church? He said, you just show up as you are. And so I passed the hour, went to the church, 20 people. They welcomed me in. They cried with me. They were sympathetic to my loss. And they invited me back to a Bible study on the Wednesday evening. It was interesting because between then and the Wednesday, I was propositioned by one of the hotel staff who turned out was a marijuana addict. And somehow I managed to avoid that. I said to her, why don't we just meet on the beach? I need to go to church for a Bible study. Well, that was the last I heard of her. So I showed up at the Bible study on the Wednesday evening, and the pastor was teaching, how do you know you drawing closer to God? And it had to do with forgiving and reconciling with family. And then he mentioned something about getting to know his word. I didn't know what he was talking about. I worked it out after a while. That had to be the Bible.
Right. And
so I went to him afterwards and I said, is the word the Bible? And he looked at me and he said, I've got just what you need. He went to the back and he got a new NIV handout, which is the Gospel of John. And he gave it to me and he said, if you read this and come back on Sunday, I'll give you a free Bible.
That's good. Gave you some homework.
Well, it didn't have the effect you would expect. I've preached on this. I thought, typical hypocrites. Do they not know that I own the presidential suite in the Poipu Hotel, that I'm a multimillionaire? If I wanted a Bible, I would buy it.
Sure.
That's the last you'll see of me. And I got in my car, drove back to the hotel, flipped the thing onto the top of the bed, and went to the hot tub. And when I came back, I was still hurting. And I walked past the bed and I saw it lying at the top of the bed. It was blue. And the words contempt prior to investigation came back to me. My first massage therapist. And so I picked it up and I opened it, and in the preamble to the NIV handout, it says there's a hole in our heart that we're trying to fill. And we can fill it with alcohol or sex or power or money. And I went, yes, 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 yes.
That's what it said there.
That's what it says in the front in the preamble. It's not part of the Bible, it's the preamble.
Right. So.
And then it says, but it's a God-shaped hole that can only be filled by Jesus. And I said, no. But for some reason, I carried on reading. And I read...
Well, you were going to prove it wrong.
I read through the Gospel of John, and I know at 10:20 on the 10th of October 2001, I sat up and I knew I was not alone in that room. And I heard, I am the way, the truth, and the life. Follow me. And I knew I was in the presence of Jesus. I was pretty scared. I turned to the back of the NIV handout. There it had the sinner's prayer. I went outside all by myself and I knelt on the balcony and I repeated the prayer and I asked God to come into my life and to forgive me.
Wow.
And I got lifted up, I don't think physically, and dumped on my face, and I wept. I cried because I knew that I'd been forgiven. And the pictures of the women and the children would finally go. It took a long time for them to go, but I was born again that night. And it was shocking to me because I was a practicing Buddhist. The only born again that I knew was a movement back in South Africa that my father was less than disparaging about. And so the next morning, after a pretty poor night's sleep, I went down to the meeting on the beach, and through a mix-up in some names, I got invited to a party that night. And I went to the party. I didn't know why I was there. I felt terribly uncomfortable until a person by the name of T.Y.
What kind of party?
It was just a barbecue, a
Yeah,
typical Hawaii barbecue.
Yeah.
And he called the family together and formed a circle and said, "Let us pray." And he was a pastor of a home church group in Tuolumne. I went straight up to him and I said, "Can I tell you what happened to me last night?" And he proceeded to explain to me what had happened to me. And I said, "Well, that's just wonderful, thank you." And they said, "Where will you be at church?" I said, "I'll be back at the church on Sunday." Well, on the Sunday, the whole family were there. They wanted to see if this was for real. And they adopted me. Being in America, I didn't have any family. They didn't adopt me legitimately,
Right,
but
you
they
were old
made
enough,
me
but-
their extra son. And for the next 5 years, I went to their home for Thanksgiving every year. What I expect to call my parents and tell them I was no longer a Buddhist. Dad said that I'd lost my mind. My sisters wanted to have absolutely nothing to do with it. The interesting thing was I was convicted pretty well right away that this carousing with ladies had to stop. And soon after, the church asked me if I would lead a singles group. And I committed to living single for 3 months, and it actually turned into 3 years. And that's a story in itself.
Right, but that's okay. That kind of, I sometimes having a relationship with God is enough to feed you for a little while, and I think it can be.
I loved being single. I would tell ladies when I met them that I was committed to being single for 3 years. And at first they would think I was teasing them. Then they would try and get me to change my mind. I'm not sure why. It was almost like I took it on as a challenge.
Sure.
And then I got to talk to women about what makes women tick. And I had the most wonderful 3 years talking to ladies about how they saw life, how they saw relationships. And in some ways it was difficult to break away from that at the end of it.
Well, that is, we are coming very close to the end of our time. That also leads into part of the next portion of your life, which I'm very interested to hear about, yeah, your love life. And we've just reached the end of our conversation with Alex. So in the next episode, we're going to find out what happened after he became a Christian and other fun things. Thank you for joining us.